The thermometer nailed to the post outside Halvard Sunday's door read 42 below zero, and it had not moved in 3 days. It was the third week of January in the winter the men of the Kettle Valley would name for the rest of their lives, the winter of 1896, and the cold had come down out of the North Country like a judgment, silent and total, freezing the North Fork to its gravel and stopping the smoke in the chimneys. On every homestead up and down the valley, cattle were dying where they stood, their breath gone to frost on their own hides, and the fine-swept barns that had been the pride of the district stood cold and silent as tombs. But at the Sunday place, banked low against the north hill, one long sod-roofed barn breathed. Steam rose off its vents into the black air and hung there, pale in the starlight, and from inside came the small, warm sounds of animals at ease, the shift of hooves in deep straw, the slow grinding of cud, the sigh of a heifer settling into the pack. When Cyrus Loomis came pounding on Halvard's door near midnight, half frozen in the saddle and begging shelter for the dozen head he had left, he stopped on the threshold of that barn and could not speak. It was warm inside, not warmed by any stove, for there was none. It was warm the way a living thing is warm, from the inside out, and it had been warm all winter long, and every man in the valley had called it the filthiest folly ever raised on the North Fork. To understand how one man's barn kept its heat while the whole valley froze, you have to go back better than 20 years to the day a broad, slow-spoken Norwegian walked his oxen down into the Kettle Valley and looked at the coming cold with a different set of eyes than the men already settled there. Halvard Sunday had come over from a hard fjord country in the Old World, where the winters ran longer than the Kettle Valleys, but the people had 10 centuries of practice at not dying in them. He was, by the time this story finds him in his middle 50s, a broad, slow-spoken man with a rust and gray beard, pale flint blue eyes, and knuckles scarred white from cold work. He had taken up a poor quarter section low against the North Hill, damp, shadowed ground the other settlers had passed over, and he had married a valley woman named Merritt, a straight-backed woman with wind-reddened cheeks and a stillness that made her few words land hard. For 18 winters, the Sundays had scraped along with a small herd and a smaller name in the district, and every autumn Halvard watched his neighbors do a thing that troubled him more each year. He watched them throw their heat away. In the country he came from, a barn was not a thing set apart from the house, but a thing joined to it, and beasts and folk wintered close under one long roof through nights far darker and colder than any the Kettle Valley knew. The byres there were bedded deep in straw that was never once carried out until the spring, so that by the black heart of winter a beast stood on a pack of its own, making a full foot and more below its hooves, and the old people knew, without ever needing the why of it, that such a floor gave back a low, steady warmth all its own. Halvard had stood in those warm, dark byres as a green hand, breathing that thick, earthy air, and he had carried the memory of it across an ocean without once thinking to ask what made the warmth. The Kettle Valley taught him to ask, for here the fashion was the opposite in every particular, and it was killing good cattle every hard winter, and no one seemed to notice. Every fall, when the grass browned and the first hard frosts came down, the good stockmen of the Kettle Valley scraped their barns to the bare plank and the packed clay, forked the summer's manure out onto the fields or into a frozen heap behind the corral, and swept the floors clean as a kitchen table. A clean barn was a proud barn. Everyone knew it. Filth bred fever, the almanac said, and a hardy beast wanted dry, cold air and a clean floor under it. And a stockman who let the muck build up beneath his cattle was a slattern who would lose the herd to sickness by spring. The finest barn in the district belonged to Cyrus Loomis, a tall, spare man with a jaw like a plow blade, a town-bought coat, and a habit of laughing before a man finished speaking. Loomis ran the best herd on the North Fork. His barn was painted red and white, and inside it he kept a cast-iron stove that he fed with cordwood through the coldest nights. Any man, he liked to say, who could not keep stock alive with good wood and good sense had no business owning stock at all. But Halvard, hauling his own manure out one gray December, stopped and stood a long while over the heap behind his corral, watching it steam. It was 10 below that morning. The snow had melted back in a wide dark ring all around the pile, and where he sank his fork into the center of it, the tines came out warm, and a smell of live heat rose off it, thick and earthy, the very smell of those warm byres of the old country. He had known that warmth the whole of his life, and never once thought to ask where it came from. Now, standing over the steaming heap with the cold biting his face raw, he asked it, and the answer, when it came to him over that winter, was so plain that he laughed aloud in the empty corral. The heat was not left behind by the animals. The heap was making its own. The rot itself was burning, slow, wet, and proof against the cold, and it had been throwing off warmth under his fork every winter of his life while he carried it out to freeze uselessly on the snow. From that December on, Halvard Sunday read the heap the way other men read Scripture. Through the whole winter of 1893, he tried it and tested it, out behind the corral where no one came. And he learned its moods one by one. He found that a heap of pure manure heated fast and fierce, and then died inside a week, going sour and stone cold. But when he forked in straw and spoiled hay by turns, layer on layer, and wet each course down and trod it hard, the heat came on slower and lower and lasted a month, and then 2. A patient buried fire that fed on nothing but rot and damp and time. He dug into old heaps in February and found them warm at the core while the air above stood at 20 below. He sank a crock of water into one and dug it out a week later unfrozen. And in his plain, unlettered way he came to understand a thing the learned chemists of the great cities were only then setting down in their journals, that the breaking down of dung and straw by the small, unseen life within it threw off a real and steady heat, and that a heap built right and fed right was a furnace that lit itself and asked no wood of any man. And so he formed the notion the whole valley would soon call the filthy folly, if a heap of rot could hold its heat through a February. Then a barn built like a heap could hold its cattle through a winter. He would not sweep his barn, he would do the opposite of everything the district held sacred. He would bed his cattle deep in straw and never carry it out. Let the manure and the straw pack down together beneath their own hooves the whole winter through. A living floor, a foot deep, and then 2. Quietly composting under the herd and warming the barn from below like one great low hearth. And beneath the barn itself, before ever he brought the cattle in, he would sink a buried mound, a pit dug the length of the barn and the depth of a grave, packed with layered manure and straw and spoiled hay, capped over with earth, with hollow wooden flues laid through it to draw the heat up and run it along under the floor. The rot below, the pack above, the warm bodies of the beasts between, 3 sources of a single warmth, and not one stick of wood burned to raise it. He built it in the summer of 1894, and he built it strange. He dug the pit that June with a borrowed slip scraper. And the men who rode the county road reined up to watch him and rode on shaking their heads. He filled it all through July, course by course, hauling in every fork of manure he could beg or buy from men glad to be shed of it, packing straw and spoiled hay between, wetting each layer from a barrel on a stone boat and treading it down with his boots and his patient ox. He laid his flues of hollowed cottonwood through the pack, capped the whole of it under a foot of tamped earth, and over it raised a low barn banked deep into the north hill, its walls double-coursed with sod, its roof heavy with turf, its windows few and small, its one broad door opening south, away from the wind. When it was finished, it did not look like a barn at all. It looked like a long grave with a chimney, a brown wart on the green hillside, and it breathed out, even from the road, even in the clean cold of that first autumn, the deep earthy smell of the rot laid up at its heart. The Kettle Valley named it before the snow flew. Sunday's Foley, the kinder ones called it. The Dung Barn, said the rest. Cyrus Loomis, riding past one October afternoon with a string of fine stock behind him, drew up at the fence and laughed before Halvard had even straightened from his work. "You have built your cattle a warm grave, Sunday," he said. "You will smother them in their own filth by Christmas, or the fever will carry them off, and the stink of the place reaches clear to the church door." He was not all cruelty, Loomis. In the same breath he offered to sell Halvard a good stove at a fair price and say no more about it. The whole valley stood with him. The storekeeper down in Ballard kept a joke behind his counter about the man who stabled his cattle in a compost pile. The women spoke of the smell of it. The men spoke of the sickness that clean barn folk had dreaded for 100 years, and warned one another that a warm, wet barn was a nursery for every rot and fever a herd could take. Only Merritt said nothing against it. She had watched him bury the crock and dig it out unfrozen. She had felt the warmth rise off the finished floor through the soles of her boots. And a straight-backed woman with wind-reddened cheeks and a stillness that made her few words land hard is not easily moved by what the storekeeper finds funny. The winter of the mockery was a cold one in more than the weather. Word of the Dung Barn traveled the way such things travel in a thin, settled country, from the store to the church to the branding pens. And it stuck to the Sundays like the smell the valley swore it could catch from the road. At the spring gathering, when the district met to work its stock, the other men left a wide berth around Halvard at the fire and made their jokes just loud enough, and one of them, a heavy loud homesteader named Orrin Slade, took to calling him the Compost King to his face and laughing at his own wit. Halvard took it the way he took the weather, without much comment, forking his share of the work, and saying his few words to the men who would still trade words with him. But Merritt felt it sharper, in the pews and at the store counter, in the small turnings away that women manage without a syllable spoken, and there were nights that winter she asked him quietly whether it was worth the whole valley's back turned to them. Halvard would only say that a turned back was a cheap price, and that the winters would have the last word and bank the stove and go up to bed. He believed it. She chose to. The fear of disease was the one that had teeth, and it came to Halvard's gate wearing a respectable coat. The valley had no proper animal doctor, but it had an old horse and cattle man named Ephraim Teal who had doctored stock along the North Fork for 30 years, and whose word carried like law. Teal walked the barn once that first fall, at the district's urging, sniffing at the deep straw and the warm, damp air with his lips pressed white, and he gave his verdict on the church steps that Sunday so that all could hear it. A beast, he said, was made for the cold and hardened by it, and a barn kept as warm and foul as that one would breed foot rot and lung fever and soften the herd till the first true frost cut it down like grass. It was the oldest wisdom in the country, and it was wrong, but it had 100 years of dead cattle behind it that had died of other things. And no man in the valley was fool enough to wager a herd against Ephraim Teal. Halvard heard the verdict out, said only that he would keep his numbers and let the winters speak, and went home to nail a thermometer to his center post. For that was Halvard's son's one answer to all of it. He kept his numbers. He nailed a thermometer to the barn's center post and another outside the door. And with a stub of tallow candle and a scrap of ledger paper, he wrote the two figures down morning and night all winter long, the way another man might keep a diary of his sorrows. He brought his small herd in ahead of the first blizzard of November 1894 and bedded them deep, and for 2 full months the folly worked better than even he had dared to hope. Outside, the glass fell to 20 below, and then 30. Inside, it held near 40 above, warm as a root cellar in spring, and the cattle stood easy in the deep straw, with the buried flues breathing heat up around their legs. The pack rose beneath them week by week as he forked fresh straw over the dung, and the barn gave off its thick, live warmth and its thick, live smell. And the frost never once crept past the door. Men who came to scoff went away troubled and quiet, and told themselves the real cold had not yet come. Then, in the second week of February 1895, the folly seemed to fail. The buried mound, the great pit he had labored a whole July to lay, the very centerpiece of the design, went cold. He felt the flues cool under his hand over the space of a few days. The heat that had breathed up from below faltered and died, and the thermometer on the post began to slide. He had built the mound of too much manure and too little straw, packed it too tight and starved it of air, and it had burned itself out hard and fast, exactly as his earliest heaps had done. And now it lay dead and cold beneath the barn, where he could not rebuild it without tearing up the whole floor. Word of it got out, the way such word does. Cyrus Loomis heard it at the store and laughed his laugh, and said he had given the folly until Christmas and been a full month too generous. The dung barn had gone cold. The valley considered the question closed, but Halvard Sunde was a man who kept his numbers, and his numbers told him a thing the valley could not see. For though the buried mound had died, the barn had not gone cold with it. It had cooled, and then it had leveled and held a great deal warmer than the killing air outside, and it was holding now on nothing but the deep-bedded floor and the warm bodies of the beasts that stood upon it. He knelt in the straw and dug his hand down into the pack between the hooves of his cattle, down through the fresh straw and the trodden dung, and a foot down the pack was warm as a loaf just drawn from the oven, warm along the whole length of the barn, and warming still. The truth of his own invention turned itself over in his cold hands right there on the barn floor. He had thought the buried mound the engine and the bedded floor its helper. It was the other way about. The mound was a thing a man built once and then lost. But the pack, the humble trodden floor he need never carry out, that his own cattle turned and fed and made anew with every hour they stood on it, the pack was a heat bank that filled itself. He had spent the whole winter tending the wrong fire. The right one had been rising under his feet the entire time, and it asked him for nothing but fresh straw and patience. He spent the summer of 1895 building the folly over again, this time around the truth he had knelt in. He did not dig out the dead mound. He left it for a dry foundation and forgot it. Everything went now to the pack. He floored the barn to carry a bed of straw 2 feet deep and better, and he worked out the feeding of that bed the way a man works out the feeding of a fire. A fresh course of clean straw forked over the whole floor every single day. So the dung was always buried and always breaking down, the rot never stopping and never turning sour. He learned the barn's one true danger, which was neither filth nor fever but damp. A pack worked too wet, or a barn shut too tight, would sweat and go sour and foul the air the beasts had to breathe. So he cut narrow vents high beneath the eaves, a hand's breadth apiece, to let the wet breath of the barn slip away at the top while the heat stayed banked low in the pack where the cattle stood. He learned to read the whole barn by its steam and its smell as another man reads a sky. Built so, fed so, breathing so, the pack held a slow, deep, self-renewing warmth from November clear through to the thaw, and never a stick of wood burned to keep it. The winter that followed, the winter of 1895, was a soft one, and it did the folly no good at all in the eyes of the valley. The barn held warm and easy straight through it. Halvard's cattle came out fat and glossy in the spring, while other men's came out gaunt. His heifers calved warm and clean in January, when calving on the open range was a wager against the frost. But the cold that year never showed its teeth. It never once fell past 20 below, and a soft winter proves nothing to a hard man. And the stockmen of the Kettle Valley were not about to muck up their clean, proud barns on the strength of one mild spell. Any barn holds in an easy winter, said Cyrus Loomis, and he was right. And the folly stood yet another year under its cloud, warm and steaming and mocked, waiting on a winter hard enough to settle the matter for good and all. That winter came the very next year, and it came as the killing kind. The autumn of 1896 ran dry, and then, early hard, the North Fork froze a full month before its time, and the old men who read the geese and the winter coats of the horses went quiet and laid in wood. The first blizzard struck the week before Christmas and did not so much pass over as take up residence. Then, in the second week of January 1897, the great cold came down, that still, silent, killing cold that comes without a breath of wind and is worse than any storm when the sky goes hard and white and the glass falls past 30 below, past 40, and simply stays. It stayed 11 days, 42 below at Halvard's door, and it did not move. It was a cold that split fence rails with a crack like a rifle shot, that froze the axe to the chopping block, that could kill a standing beast before it thought to lie down. The clean, proud barns of the Kettle Valley failed one after another in that cold, and they failed for the very reason they were clean. Swept down to the cold clay, open to the wind at every eve, holding nothing but the thin, quick heat of the animals themselves, they could not stand an hour against 40 below, and no stove ever forged could keep pace with a cold that drank up heat faster than cordwood could make it. Cyrus Loomis fed his cast-iron stove day and night until his wood was gone inside a week, and still the frost walked in under his fine-painted walls, and his cattle stood in the swept-clean cold and died on their feet in the dark, and there was nothing that all his good wood and good sense could do to stop it. Up and down the valley it was the same. Men woke to barns full of the dead and the dying, breath frozen fast to the hide. The pride of the district turned to carcasses too hard frozen to drag. The herds that had made the Kettle Valley what it was were dying in a week, in the finest barns in the country, and the smoke of stoves lit too late stood straight up and useless into the still air over every roof. Halvard Sunday did what he could in those 11 days, which was not much, for the cold beat any man who stood out in it. He broke his way through the drifts to the nearest homesteads with what fodder he could sledge, and twice he brought half-frozen stock back to the folly and thawed them in the deep pack, and everywhere he went he found the same thing behind the barn doors, the swept-clean floors, the useless dead stoves. The good hardy cattle that the good hardy wisdom had killed. He found men he had known for 18 winters standing dazed among their frozen herds, men who had laughed at him in the autumn, and not one of them said a word about the folly now, and neither did he. There was no satisfaction in it that he could find. A dead herd was a dead herd, whosever it was. And the sight of a whole valley's wealth standing frozen on its feet in the barns that were meant to keep it was not a thing a decent man could take any pleasure from, whatever had been said of him. He sledged his fodder and thawed what stock he could, and went home each dusk to the one warm barn, and kept his numbers and said little. Every homestead but one, at the Sunday place, banked low against the north hill, the folly breathed. Through all 11 days of the killing cold, the deep pack burned its slow wet fire beneath the cattle. Their own warm bodies gave to it and took from it. The sod walls held the heat close, and the small high vents let the damp breath go. And inside that long, dark barn it held near 40 above, while the whole world outside stood at 40 below. A swing of 80 degrees across 2 feet of sod, and a floor of the very rot that every other man in the valley carried out on a fork and cursed. Steam rose off the vents into the black still air and hung there in the starlight above the one warm barn in a valley of frozen ones. Halvard's cattle stood easy in the deep straw and worked their cud. 2 heifers calved in the thick of the worst of it, there in the warm dark, and both calves lived and stood and nursed, while a mile off the finest stock in the district froze on its feet in a swept-clean barn around a stove gone gray and cold at its heart. It was on the 9th night of the great cold that Cyrus Loomis came pounding on Halvard Sunday's door near midnight, half frozen in the saddle, with a dozen head he had left roped along behind him and no place left on the earth to put them. He had burned his wood and buried the most of his herd and shed the last of his pride somewhere out on that frozen road, and he stood now on the threshold of the dung barn with the frost gone white in his beard and could not get a word out. Warm air rolled out around him into the night. Inside, in the amber light of Halvard's swinging lantern, cattle stood at their ease on a floor of steaming straw, and the smell the whole valley had mocked 3 winters running wrapped around him, thick and earthy and alive. The smell that night of the only warmth left in the Kettle Valley. Halvard said not one word about the folly. He said nothing at all. He took the rope from Loomis's frozen hands, led the dozen head in through the broad south door, and bedded them down in the deep pack among his own. Then he brought Loomis in out of the cold, and set him by the warmth, and let the heat come back into his hands. And the 2 men sat a long while in the steaming dark, and said none of the things that did not need saying. When the great cold broke at last, and the valley came out to count its dead, the tally was a thing men would speak of in low voices for a generation. Whole herds gone. The Loomis stock, the finest on the North Fork, cut down to the dozen head that had wintered out those last 2 nights in Halvard's barn. Up and down the Kettle Valley, the fine-swept barns had killed the very stock they were built to keep, while the folly on the North Hill had carried every beast in it through the hardest winter in living memory without the loss of a single head, and with 2 good calves to the better besides. No one laughed at the dung barn after that spring. The name simply fell out of use. Ephraim Teal, who had promised foot rot and lung fever from the church steps, walked the warm barn again in April and stood a long time over the deep pack without a word, and what he finally allowed was that a man lived long enough to see every certainty he owned turned over at least the once. The thing that finally turned the hard men was not the sight of the warm barn, though that was much. It was the numbers. Halvard had kept them faithful for 3 winters, morning and night, the outside glass and the inside glass written down in a stub of pencil on ledger paper gone soft with handling. And when the doubters came in the spring, he laid the sheets out on a plank for them to read. There it was in his plain hand, the whole killing winter set down in 2 columns, 40 and 42 below on the one side, 8 and 30 and 40 above on the other, day after day after day, 80 degrees of warmth held across 2 feet of sod and a floor of rot, on no fuel but the muck they all forked out and cursed. A man could argue with a smell. A man could argue with a folly. It was a good deal harder to argue with 3 winters of a man's own honest figures laid out in 2 plain columns on a plank, and one by one, reading them, the hard men of the Kettle Valley stopped arguing. Men who had offered Halvard a stove came now instead to stand in his barn and feel the warmth rise up through their boots, and to ask him, awkward and turning their hats in their hands, how a man went about the building of such a thing. Halvard told them plainly, for he had never been one to keep a good thing to himself. He told them not to sweep their barns. He told them to bed deep and to feed the pack fresh straw and never to carry it out until spring, to cut small vents up high and let the barn breathe, and to trust at last the rot they had spent their whole lives despising. Some of them believed him now, having seen with their own eyes. By the next winter there were 4 warm barns along the North Fork, and by the winter after that a dozen, and the men who raised them wondered aloud to one another how their fathers had ever borne to carry all that good heat out onto the snow. Cyrus Loomis built his herd back slowly over the years that came after, and he built a deep-bedded barn to winter it in, banked low against a hill, and never again did he speak of clean floors and good stoves. He and Halvard grew, if not close, then easy with one another, in the way of men who have sat out together a cold that could have killed the both of them. Once, years on, a newcomer to the valley asked Loomis about the strange warm barns the district had grown known for, and wherever the notion had come from, and Loomis tipped his chin up the north hill toward the Sunday place and said only that there had been a man who saw the use in a thing the rest of them threw away, and that it had cost the whole valley a winter of dead cattle to learn to see it too. The warm barns spread past the Kettle Valley in time, the way a good idea will once a hard winter has vouched for it. Stockmen from 2 valleys over rode in to see the folly on the North Hill and rode home to bed their own herds deep, and here and there a farm paper printed a plain account of the thing. A barn warmed through a killing winter on nothing but manure and straw and the patient rot within them. None of it made Halvard Sunday rich, for he never thought to charge a man for the truth, and none of it made him proud in any way a stranger could have seen. He was the same broad, slow man at 60 that he had been at 50, forking fresh straw over his pack of a winter morning, reading his barn by its steam, keeping his 2 columns of figures out of a habit he no longer needed. The difference was only that the road no longer slowed to laugh as it passed. and that the smell off his barn, which had once been the joke of the district, had become in the valley's mind the smell of the one man who had been right. Halvard Sundi wintered his cattle warm on rotten straw for the rest of his days, and never burned a stick of wood to do it, and never once said a word to remind the valley how it had laughed. He kept a saying from the old country that he would give to the men who came to learn the trick of the warm barn, and it was the nearest he ever came to gloating. A wise man, he would tell them, warms his hands at a fire he never lit. He had spent his whole life learning to build such a fire out of the one thing every other man in the valley had carried out on a fork and cursed. And the cold, which is the most honest teacher there is, had in the end taught the whole Kettle Valley to build it too.